Sawadee Krap, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video presentation. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the problem with the classification of steroid cycles by the terms bulking cycle and cutting cycle. This is a terminology that's really been with us for really 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. People have been referring to cycle planning in terms of like this is for a bulking cycle or this is for a cutting cycle, and today's video is going to explain the problem with that type of thinking and to offer you I guess an alternative framework, the framework that I like to refer to when I'm talking about steroid cycle planning with due regard to our immediate, our short-term goal for that cycle. So let's get started with today's video. The title of the video, bulking and cutting cycles versus the terminology that I prefer to use, which is growth, maintenance, fat loss, and competition cycles. Okay, so make no mistake, whenever we talk about these videos, I try to present what I believe to be benefits to you, the user, of investing in this thinking. And I'm very prepared to talk about the disadvantages as well. So we're going to talk about both of those up front. Let me just explain to you why I believe you should be thinking in terms of basically growth cycles, maintenance cycles, fat loss cycles, and competition preparation cycles in terms of simply bulking and cutting. And that is primarily with due regard to your health. Okay, so when we talk about cycle planning, there's a need for us to plan time away from the stresses of these drugs, right? You need to have a break. You just do, right? So when you talk about like cycle planning and you're saying, okay, so this is a growth cycle and this is a cutting cycle, then my question is, well, when are you going to take a break? You need to have a break plan here somewhere, okay? So, what are you going to be doing with due regard to your steroid planning during those periods of time where you need to have a detoxification or a de-stress, if you like that term, away from the implications of use of these compounds? You have to factor this in, and the very, very simple terminology, the very, very simple of thinking of this is for bulking and this is for cutting, doesn't really allow for that. And if that's still confusing, that's fine. Let me explain as we get deeper into it, is by simply changing the way you approach cycle planning, you can allow yourself to have periods of time of minimal stress and still achieve your goals. All right, so this is the benefit to you. This is a discussion about how you can have better outcomes balanced against better health consequence by changing the way you think about how steroid cycles are supposed to be planned, moving away from the 1970s type thinking of bulking and cutting cycles. So disadvantages. Are there any disadvantages? Absolutely. Without question, there are disadvantages to everything. There are pros and cons to everything in life. So the disadvantages here are, we're going to be talking about more quote-unquote moving parts, which means this is more complicated than simple bulking, cutting, bulking, cutting, bulking, cutting. There are more moving parts, and that means you need to think more. Right? This is not content for bros. This is content for the thinking man's bodybuilder, the guy that's interested in leveraging these compounds in an intelligent way, right? This is, yes, absolutely, more moving parts. This is more to think about. And quite bluntly, I'm prepared to accept the fact that there's also, you're going to have a break with what I call bro law. You're going to be using different language here than 90% of the community, and that can lead to problems. I see guys all the time like get their hackles up because I'm changing the thinking of bro law. And whenever you're in, are talking about change, some people don't like to change, quite bluntly. So yes, there are disadvantages to the adoption of this type of thinking. More moving parts, you need to think more, and yes, you're going to be going against what most of the community accept as the way this is done. But hopefully, by the time we get to the end of this video, you will see the very real benefits to thinking this way, and hopefully those benefits are large enough for you to consider the adoption of my thinking here, and use it as part of the way that you plan cycles moving forward. So, as I said, this is about changing our mindset from simply this is a bulking cycle, this is a cutting cycle, to saying, oh, hang on a sec, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We have a need for growth phases. We're going to have a need for maintenance phases. We have a fat loss need. We have a potential for competition cycle. There's even, as we get deeper into this, you'll see, in the small changes we make with due regard to what we call, peaking. So that like the very small period of time immediately around the show period, there's even potentially a post-show discussion that needs to happen. So more moving parts, more to think about, agreed, but potentially you're going to get better outcomes, both with due regard to actual walk away hypertrophic response, but also better health from this type of thinking. So let's just basically talk about one element of that here, and that is the concept of a cutting cycle. So on one hand, we have what we're going to refer to as a cutting cycle. People, you'll see them often post on Facebook and various user community groups and forums and things like that, but this idea of a quote-unquote cutting cycle, right? What sort of drugs should you use? How long should that last for? Etc., etc. The doses that you might potentially want to use. I'm going to propose that things are a little bit more complicated than that, right? So this is the model that I basically use, and it is understanding that, quote-unquote cutting actually needs to be broken down into a higher level of granularity, a higher level of visibility, and we'll talk about separate sections of that. So to give you a simple example of what I mean by that, when I first started training 30 odd years ago, people started getting ready for bodybuilding shows 12 weeks out from the show. That's how things were done back then. It was almost universally accepted, regardless of whether you were natural or you were training enhanced, that a competition preparation process was 12 weeks long. I remember guys, first doing 16 weeks sort of preps, and people thinking, that's a long time, right? And the reality is the guys that did slightly longer preps either got one or two outcomes from that. Either they had a little bit easier time, they didn't have to brutalize themselves quite as severely over a 12-week time frame, just take things a little bit more slowly and got somewhat similar outcomes, or quite bluntly, those additional 4 weeks of dieting allowed them to realize slightly better levels of conditioning. And so it wasn't very long before guys started doing ever longer and longer and longer competition preparation processes, right? This is something that I witnessed myself in my training career. And today it's fair to say that people don't really do 12-week competition preps anymore. In fact, if you actually look at the elite level naturals, one could argue that their conditioning is better than the enhanced trainers. And there's a number of reasons before that, but but if you actually look at like how long they're taking for competition preparation today, it's in excess of 30 weeks. All right, it's not even 6 months now. It's longer than 6 months. So, understanding that, this is what really has driven this need to basically move away from the simple cutting, right, to a somewhat more complex conversation. The fact that we're not doing 12-week cutting cycles anymore, right? When you spend that amount of time getting ready for a show, right, you potentially have greater scope to make changes or have different philosophies or planning within that sort of framework for better outcomes and better health. So in a simplistic way, let me explain what that might be. There's no reason if you're going to do a 30-week contest preparation that you need to necessarily pull out what I call the body image phase right from the beginning of the show. There's absolutely no need to do that. It's possible for us to have a number of cards that we might potentially deploy over that process that we deploy as we get closer and closer to the show. There is no question, there is no doubt that there are certain drugs that help us to create a certain look and feel that really shines on the stage. Unfortunately for us, those drugs are also the drugs that come with the greatest concern of use in terms of due regard to health. All right, everybody, I'm sure, is aware of the types of drugs that are used for bodybuilding competition preparation. Not so many people are aware of the potential health risks associated with their use, and I am the first person to accept the fact that I also use those drugs. I don't shy away from that. I use Trenbolone, I use halotestin, I use these types of compounds, even Anadrol, but I use them sparingly. All right, I use them in a way that is the smallest possible exposure to these drugs possible, right? And therefore what I do is I don't deploy them from day one on a 30-week competition preparation cycle. I don't, right? I use them in the last kind of 8 weeks, yeah? 8 weeks is more than enough for those types of drugs to basically have reached full effect, all right? You don't need to expose yourself to the stresses of those compounds for 30 weeks to create a look and a feel. So how I like to break this down, let me break this down in what I hope is the simplest manner possible. If we were to say, okay, so from here, from starting point to show day is going to be a 30-week time frame, and I'm just arbitrarily choosing 30 weeks. You don't have to spend 30 weeks getting ready for a show. How long is your show preparation process going to last? That's predominantly going to be determined by the condition that you're in when you begin that process. I mean, there are recommendations about the maximum amount of body fat that you should attempt to wash off leading into a show with due regard to minimizing muscle loss, all right? Those recommendations, if you follow them, and I recommend that you do, would typically sort of lead yourself to this discussion that you should be, losing between 0.5% and 1% of body weight, right, per week. All right, so what does that mean in the real world? If you take a guy like myself, whose my on-stage weight is about 100 kilograms, 220 pounds, basically what that means is I should be aiming to lose between 1 and a maximum of 2 pounds of body fat per week, right, in order to minimize muscle loss. And I completely agree with that recommendation. However, I would actually go one step further and say the closer we get to competition day, the leaner we get, the kinder we need to be with each other. So I would basically premise that and say early into the competition preparation process, you get well to be able to be quite aggressive with fat loss with minimal impact on muscle loss. And the closer you get in the final weeks, you might even want to be even more moderate than those recommendations. Very slowly, even as much as like 0.5 pound a week in the final weeks. So back to my point here, we're immediately starting to see, we're not talking about now a linear preparation where we begin 12 weeks out and we just basically deploy what we're going to deploy and see it all the way through the show. We have stages, more aggressive potentially early on, and gentler on ourselves, in the final few weeks, okay? 2 pounds a week early may be very practical. 0.5 pound a week may be a requirement in the final few weeks, and so this is a non-linear approach. Now, does it make sense then, when we balance these two things together, that we're talking about a non-linear approach to competition preparation? Absolutely. And this is the point behind no longer talking about quote-unquote cutting cycles, but saying, well, hang on a sec, there are potentially stages in this process of cutting that we need to take into account. There's a fat loss phase where we're not really trying to create a look and a feel that's going to be presented to anyone. It's about washing off as aggressively as possible the body fat that we've accumulated in our growth phase, getting ourselves within spitting distance, I like to say, to the stage where we potentially at that point might introduce, some of these more aggressive competition drugs that undeniably create a look and a feel, but we know aren't great for us, and so we want to minimize our exposure to those things. So if we were to look at this, you might say, okay, so we're going to have an 8 weeks period here leading into the show. Maybe this is a 1 week. This is the concept of peak week. One week here. Sorry, 1 week here, which is peak week, and that potentially is different again. And then what we have is a period of time here where we're kind of going, okay, so there's 20 or there's 21 weeks, of a requirement to wash off body fat. But do we really need to, stress ourselves with high levels of androgens at this point in time? Because no one's really potentially judging us at that time. Our goal is to maximize retention of skeletal muscle, to maximize the reduction of body fat, but we don't really need that grainy, hard, dry, dense look that we're trying to create for the stage. So, and here's the change in thinking. Might we use that time to have a break? And that's completely counterintuitive, right? I understand that. But you need to have a break, right? So why not take an approach that says, look, I'm going to be gentle on myself in the initial stages of competition preparation or fat loss, right? And I'm going to allow myself a period of recovery and making sure that I'm doing well before I introduce this high level stress phase in the last couple of months before the show. Okay, so what do we need to do that? We don't necessarily need the most powerful compounds that are at our disposal at that point in time, because we're not going to grow, guys, quite honestly. If you're an advanced bodybuilder, if you've been training for many years, if you have advanced training age, the likelihood of you increasing skeletal muscle mass in the competition preparation process is, let's just say, unlikely. It's not impossible. There are some conditions under which you'll see that guys do that. I will agree with that. However, those individuals are what I call fairly prescriptive. You can define who they are. Typically, they're newer trainers, guys that haven't been training for a very long time. They're guys that are using maybe a little bit too much drugs, because very high superphysiological doses of drugs can do very strange things, right? The laws of biology tend to get thrown out the window when you get into very high doses of drugs. But again, that's not healthy for you, right? That's not sustainable, right? For most people, most of the time, by the time you get to the point where you want to compete, the likelihood of you being in an extended calorie deficit and adding new skeletal muscle tissue at the same time, very small, very unlikely, right? So if you subscribe to that, if that's you, then potentially you can use the early stages of competition preparation to actually take a break, right? To basically say, okay, so I'm not going to grow in the next 20 weeks. I've got 20 weeks of dieting ahead of me. I need to wash off these 25 pounds that I've acquired during my growth phase. I don't want to lose any muscle. I don't want to lose a gram of muscle, right? But I don't need to necessarily have the most powerful anabolic compounds that we have at our disposal in deployment during that period of time. That's not required. What's required is enough drugs to leverage their anti-catabolic impact, right? Which is, hopefully people are aware, one of the reasons that anabolic steroids are so powerful during contest preparation. Not only do they increase nitrogen retention, not only do they increase muscle protein synthesis, they also have an impact on muscle protein breakdown. They allow us to basically place the stress of deficit on our bodies with less impact in terms of muscle protein breakdown. It's one of their major benefits here. So my strategy here, my recommendation to guys here is stop thinking in terms of cutting cycles and basically bulking cycles, and start thinking of, okay, look, I need to basically say, well, where am I in this actual process? Am I talking about I need to wash off body fat? This is one scenario, okay? Or am I talking about the immediate few weeks right before competition where I need to create a look that basically I'm going to present on stage. Those are actually two different things. They're two different things. Washing off body fat and what I call a body image phase are two different things. You may well be losing body fat during both of those phases. However, what will separate them is how aggressively you're in a deficit. So how aggressively you're losing body fat should be different. You shouldn't have a truly linear model today like we used to do. It's not like 12 weeks diet in, that's it, right? So potentially the final few weeks leading into your show, you should be in a smaller caloric deficit if you're on the plan. And let me just say as a side note here, I'm the first person to admit we've all been there, we've all done it, we've all been in a position where we're behind the eight ball and we're brutalizing ourselves in the last 8 weeks getting ready. But we all also should know that that's not ideal, right? The closer you get to show day, the more gentle you should be on yourself in terms of a caloric deficit. But the more likelihood you're going to be introducing not only drugs that are like going to create a look for us, but potentially increasing the doses. Immediately before competition is the time where we are most likely to expose ourselves to the highest risk. In other words, the most aggressive compounds that we see during the year and the higher doses that we see during the year. But you don't need to do that for the entire duration of the competition preparation process. Okay? So, as a takeaway, as a walk away from this conversation, guys, stop thinking in terms of cutting cycles and bulking cycles. It's more complicated than that today, right? Yes, I agree. 1970, when we did 12-week competition preparations and the only guys that used drugs were competing, that was a valid and viable way of thinking. I don't have a problem with that. I used to think in those terms myself, right? But today, 2018, right, we can, up the ante a little bit in terms of the way that we think about things in the conversations that we have, and we need to be thinking in terms of more than just cutting cycle. What's your goal here? Is it to wash off body fat, right, in the most efficient and fastest manner possible without losing much skeletal muscle mass? And that's what I would call the fat loss phase, right? Okay, that doesn't require high doses of very strong androgens. It does not. Okay, it certainly will benefit from using drugs. I'm not suggesting that's when you don't use any drugs, but I'm saying you don't need a lot, and you don't need the drugs that cause us the greatest amount of stress on our body. And then there's the separate phase from that, distinct from that, where we're already at relatively low body fat. This is the final, 8 weeks. We're talking about the last 5 pounds maybe, right? Where we're going to increase the androgens. We're going to up the ante. We're going to increase the doses. Why are we increasing the doses? To lose body fat? No. Why are we increasing the doses? To build muscle? Not at that stage, brother. Jerome? We are increasing the doses to create a look, to create a feel, that grainy, hard, dense, vascular stage look, right? So this is where people make the misconception that those two things are not necessarily the same thing. You can draw a line between a fat loss phase and a body image phase, and the drugs that you take and the doses that you use and the risk of exposure that you take are potentially different things. So there are not just cutting. There are 1, fat loss phase, 2, body image phase, 3, peak week phase, 4, post-show phase, and then recovery phase. These are all encompassed in what I would call quote-unquote cutting. All right? It's more complicated than just cutting cycles. All right? So we're going to talk about each one of these phases. We're going to talk about each one of the drugs that you might potentially deploy during these phases. We're going to be talking about why would we choose those compounds. We're going to be talking about the doses that you might benefit from. We can talk about the potential side effects that you might occur in that process, how to manage, how to mitigate those side effects, and we're going to then basically bring more moving parts into play. As I said, I'm fully prepared to admit this conversation has advantages, right? Advantages to your health, advantages to better outcomes, but it has disadvantages as well. We're going to make the conversation a little bit more complicated, unfortunately. We're going to have more moving parts to understand, and that requires a thinking man's approach to this discussion. But we're basically going to allow ourselves to have the best possible outcome with the minimum possible stress. Everybody wants to be competitive. When we get on the stage, we want to be able to compete, quote unquote. All right. So I'm not, your anti-steroid crusader here. Right. I'm simply saying, right, think about what we're doing. Right. Think about the cycles we're putting together. Think about the way we're planning this. Where are you? What are your goals? Are you going to stand on the stage? Then you need to do this, this, this. Are you simply washing off body fat between two growth phases? Then you need to do that, that, that. Those are two different things. It's not a quote unquote cutting cycle. So that's it for today's video. I hope you'll join us for the additional content where, as I said, I'll look at further detail at each of these phases. And then, of course, we're going to have content that basically complements that on the flip side of the coin, where we're talking about growth and maintenance and potentially what compounds we need to deploy during those phases and the doses and the risks associated. So as always, I look forward to seeing you at the next Victor Black Masterclass video. So